For more than 2 centuries, slave breeding has been a very controversial topic in American history. The thought of slavery alone was disturbing, but then there was also the concept of forcing babies from these enslaved people to increase profit and to replace dying and aging people. Due to the fact that enslaved men and women were considered property back in the day, they could not sign any form of contract, which included marriage. As a result, their owners had total control of their lives, and they exploited them in every way they could, including their sexual lives. It is well known that enslavers fathered children with their slaves and even went as far as to sell the children off. But the genesis of this inhumane act began in 1808 when the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. Enslavers could no longer import enslaved Africans to work as laborers. To curb this effect on the slave trade, many enslavers started forcing their slaves into sexual acts with other enslaved people to procreate and give birth to children, who would then be snatched away from the mother after birth and sold again into slavery. This era was one of the worst periods to experience, and some of these enslavers even went as far as fathering their slaves. Those who could afford it would acquire men to come to sleep with their women slaves to procreate. One of these enslaved people who procreated with multiple enslaved people was Charles Magruder. According to his great-great-grandchild, Magruder was rented out to go from plantation to breed with other African women. Marie, that just like the enslaved African women, her great-great-grandfather had no choice in marriage or family, as he was also surviving himself. He was used as a tool to do dirty work, and as a result of their enslavers' actions, they believed that Magruder is the patriarch to several black people from Alabama bearing Magruder. Even without forcing enslaved men like Charles Magruder to do the dirty work, a lot of the colored women bore children for the white men, and the average enslaved woman was better than not doing what he said. Several accounts of this phenomenon spread widely, and it only took a short time before all enslavers practiced it. There are cases where the wives of these white men find out about their breeding with enslaved women, but are unable to act on it because the workforce of these enslaved people is the family's means of livelihood. Sometimes the wife doesn't find out, and the white men also won't tell. The enslaved women, on the other hand, are always afraid to talk, and so it goes on. Other stories of how slave breeding was carried out included traders buying young, strong farm men and well-developed young girls with fine physiques to sell and barter. They would bring these people to taverns where buyers and traders gathered and advertised them for sale. Sometimes, if an enslaved woman weren't sold off that night, she would be called into the trader's room to satisfy his bestial desires. Thankfully, these inhumane practices were eventually abolished. But do you know that one of the people at the forefront of the abolition of slavery was also one of the biggest enslavers in his lifetime? We're talking about Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, Thomas Jefferson, you are as great a wit as you are a statesman.
No more than you, James Madison.
In 1820, Gil Gillette went on a long journey under Thomas Jefferson's instructions to travel from Buckingham County to Richmond. The enslaved man carried a paper of great consequence sewn into his waistcoat. Little did Gillette know that the paper he handled with special care on his journey was a check of $3,500, and it was payment for the sale of enslaved men, children, and women to his son-in-law, John Wales Epps. Although Gillette was not a part of this particular slave sale to Jefferson's in-law, he and his wife Esther were sold 9 years later on the auction block in Charlottesville to William Garland for $590. Before that, Gillette's status as human property had given Jefferson the audacity to mortgage and lease him out to a tenant farmer. That being said, Thomas Jefferson's world was defined by the institution of slavery, and forced breeding was a huge part of it. Although he declared as a revolutionary in 1788 that nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition not only of the trade, but of the condition of slavery, Thomas Jefferson controlled the lives and interests of 607 people in his lifetime. He received 52 enslaved people as inheritance from his father's estate and 135 individuals from his father-in-law, John Wales, who was also a slave trader. The remaining enslaved people, totaling 607 people, were either born into captivity or purchased outright. Between 1776 and 1826, Jefferson controlled 165 and 225 enslaved people on his plantations in Virginia, with about 2/5 at Poplar Forest, his estate in Bedford, and about 3/5 of his human property at Monticello. Although the third president of the United States of America also saw himself to be a kind-hearted slaveholder who would watch for the happiness of those who labor for him, Jefferson still saw enslaved people as his assets. Jefferson profited not just from the wheat, corn, and tobacco that his slaves grew in the crop fields, but he also gained from the value that came from their bodies, especially through their natural increase. Since they were his property, every enslaved man, woman, or child that belonged to Jefferson could be bought, mortgaged, leased, sold, or given away. As the case of Gil Gillette makes clear, every enslaved person that Jefferson owned was subject to at least one of these characteristics that embodies the American slave market. Jefferson's Virginia plantations were part of a growing American slave system post-Revolutionary period. From the first few years into the 19th century, lands were available in the Southwest to cultivate cotton. This land was cleared and drained in anticipation of what would later become the Cotton Belt, a vast swath of country that began in the upcountry of the Carolinas and extended westward through Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and later Texas. The millions of hands needed to build this new cotton empire helped initiate a robust and tragic innovation of the antebellum era, the increased value and commoditization of slave bodies. As a result, in the 19th century, the commercialization of the American slave empire, leasing, mortgaging, insuring, and buying and selling human chattel indicated not simply the survival of slavery, but also the speed and scale of its expansion. Virginia played a crucial role. With the intense level of self-reproduction happening within the slave population, Virginia became the mother of slavery. Not only did Virginia claim the largest slave population in the federal union, increasing from 287,959 in 1790 to 453,698 in 1830, but it also served as the primary supplier of enslaved laborers to other states through the domestic slave trade, which transported nearly 1 million enslaved men, women, and children to the Deep South between 1820 and 1860. Like many other Virginia planters, Jefferson engaged in the business of slavery. He bought, sold, mortgaged, and leased enslaved people to accrue wealth and maintain his elite status. However, unlike many planters, Jefferson often engaged in these markets not just for material gain, but also, somewhat paradoxically, for humanitarian reasons. Reasoning that our interests soundly calculated will never be found inseparable from our moral duties, Jefferson subjected his human property to the hiring and mortgaging markets to shield them from what he considered the most evil market of all, the slave trade. However, Jefferson often failed in this endeavor, primarily because he could not manage the massive debts incurred by himself, his parents, and his father-in-law after the American Revolution. As even the former Monticello enslaved person, Isaac Granger Jefferson, knew, the portion of property that Jefferson acquired by marriage was encumbered with a British debt and resulted in a heavy loss. To satisfy these debts, which mushroomed to over $107,000 by the time of his death in 1826. Enslaved people, as Jefferson's most valuable property, were often sold on the auction block. But still viewing enslaved persons selling as a last resort, Jefferson turned to slave leasing and mortgaging for income. Jefferson's ability to hire enslaved people out and use them as collateral to secure loans was based on the increased value of slave bodies and the natural increase of the slave population. Unlike in the Caribbean, this increase allowed Virginia planters to satisfy the demand for slave labor without having to import enslaved people from Africa. Jefferson himself encouraged the reproduction of his slave population. In particular, Jefferson understood that enslaved women and their future children represented the best way to increase his holdings' value, which he called capital. To Jefferson, an enslaved woman who gave birth to a child every 2 years was more profitable than the best man of the farm, as he wrote in 1820. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while an enslaved man's labors disappear in mere consumption. In 1819, worried by a spike in infant mortality at Poplar Forest, Jefferson believed that it was for moral as well as interested considerations that overseers should preserve enslaved people's lives, not for their labor, but their increase. As Jefferson's friend and neighbor John Hartwell Cocke observed, Virginia enslavers increasingly believed that their profits consisted in the increased number and value of their slaves, rather than in the crops that their bonds produced. Jefferson argued that renting out his slaves could generate a profit without selling them. Hiring presents a hopeful prospect, Jefferson declared, as it would allow him to retain ownership of enslaved people and possibly free them in future time. Buckling under his crushing debts, Jefferson thought he had only 2 options. In a question between hiring and selling them, one of which is necessary, he wrote, "The hiring will be temporary only and will end in their happiness," which Jefferson defined as improved material conditions and the ability to remain with their families. On the other hand, he wrote, "If we sell them, they will be subject to ill usage without a prospect of change, and likely be sold southward." Jefferson felt the weight of the objection for either option since we cannot guard the Negroes perfectly against ill usage. As a result, Jefferson embraced the market in rented enslaved people, hiring out over 100 enslaved people to local artisans and tenant farmers who leased portions of his 5,000-acre plantation, comprising the Shadwell, Monticello, Lego, and Tufton quarter farms. In the 1790s, Jefferson capitalized on the increasing number and value of his slaves to increase his access to capital and protect his slaves from sale. In 1796, Jefferson feared legal action from claims against his father-in-law's estate. Under Virginia law, creditors could seize human property to satisfy debts. Jefferson sought an alternative approach to prevent his bondspeople from being sold to absolve the whale's debt. He first mortgaged 52 enslaved people to Henderson, McCall and Company, and then gave as collateral 98 other slaves to several friends and the Dutch firm of Van Staphorst and Hubbard. Jefferson received a nominal loan of $2,000 from Van Staphorst and Hubbard, which was never paid off entirely. Those enslaved people mortgaged to Jefferson's Dutch bankers included the families of Ned and Fanny Gillette, Bagwell, and Minerva Granger, among others. These mortgages demonstrated that an indebted Jefferson was trying to circumvent a legal obstacle. Slaveholders could not use verbal conveyances or emancipation to prevent creditors from seizing enslaved people. His solution was to give mortgages to friendly creditors who were unlikely to take his slaves. It also enabled him access to credit that he sorely needed. However, after the American Revolution, mounting financial pressure meant that Jefferson often turned to selling. He sold enslaved people and land. Between 1784 and 1794, Jefferson sold 84 enslaved people. At his Elk Hill plantation in Goochland County, Jefferson directed that 31 enslaved people be sold in 1785. About 7 years later, he sold 3 more groups of enslaved people from his Albemarle and Bedford estates. In December 1791, 29 enslaved people yielded over $4,000 on the auction block. Another sale a year later in Bedford County brought nearly $2,000 for 11 people. And in January of 1792, 13 enslaved people were sold away from Monticello. Together, these sales netted Jefferson over $15,000. Jefferson sold more enslaved people in this 10-year period than at any other time before his death. Ultimately, selling dozens of people and several plantations was insufficient to satisfy Jefferson's debts. Jefferson also engaged in the slave trade for reasons other than to secure a profit. He well understood the horror that sale and separation meant for enslaved people, and he sometimes employed it as the ultimate punishment for chronic runaways and enslaved people who committed violent acts. Although Jefferson maintained that he had scruples against selling Negroes, he sold them willingly for such delinquency. In 1817, Jefferson's old friend and Revolutionary War hero, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, died in Switzerland. The Polish nobleman from Europe had left a substantial fortune to Jefferson, including funds to free Jefferson's slaves and purchase land and farming equipment so that they could begin a life on their own. In the spring of 1819, Jefferson pondered what to do with the legacy. Kosciuszko had made him executor of the will, so Jefferson had a legal duty and a personal obligation to his deceased friend to carry out the terms of the document. The terms came as no surprise to Jefferson. He had helped Kosciuszko draft the will, which states, "I hereby authorize my friend, Thomas Jefferson, to employ the whole request in purchasing Negroes from his own or any others and giving them liberty in my name." Kosciuszko's estate was nearly $20,000 today, roughly $280,000. However, Jefferson refused the gift, even though it would have reduced the debt hanging over Monticello while also relieving him, in part at least, of what he had described in 1814 as the moral reproach of slavery. If Jefferson had accepted the legacy, as much as half of it would have gone not to Jefferson, but to his slaves. That is, land, livestock, equipment, and transportation are needed to establish them in places such as Illinois or Ohio. Moreover, the slaves most suited for immediate emancipation, smiths, coopers, carpenters, the most skilled farmers, were the very ones whom Jefferson most valued. He also shrank from any public identification with the cause of emancipation. It had long been accepted that enslaved people were assets that could be seized for debt, but Jefferson turned this around when he used enslaved people as collateral for a large loan he had taken out in 1796 from a Dutch banking house to rebuild Monticello. He pioneered the monetizing of enslaved people, just as he pioneered the industrialization and diversification of slavery. Before he refused Kosciuszko's legacy, as Jefferson mulled over whether to accept the request, he had written to one of his plantation managers, "A child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man." In this, as in all other cases, Providence has made our duties and interests coincide perfectly. With respect, therefore, to our women and their children, I must pray to you to inculcate upon the overseers that it is not their labor, but their increase, which is our first consideration. In the 1790s, as Jefferson was mortgaging his slaves to build Monticello, George Washington was trying to scrape together financing for emancipation at Mount Vernon, which he finally ordered in his will. He proved that emancipation was not only possible, but practical, and overturned all the Jeffersonian rationalizations. Jefferson insisted that a multiracial society with free black people was impossible, but Washington did not think so. Never did Washington suggest that blacks were inferior or that they should be exiled. In 1822, when 3 Poplar Forest enslaved people, Hercules, Gawain, and Billy, were charged with seer and wickedly and feloniously having consulted upon the subject of rebelling and making insurrection, Jefferson directed that they be transported south as an example to N. Orleans to be sold. When the chronic runaway, James Hubbard, was forcibly recovered from his second quest for freedom, Jefferson advised that he be sold out of the state, since he will never again serve any man as a slave. When the enslaved nailmaker Carey nearly killed fellow enslaved nailer Brown Colbert with a hammer, Jefferson wanted to make an example to him in terror to others. Carey was to be sold to Negro purchasers, to a quarter so distant as never more to be heard of among us. Jefferson inflicted the ultimate punishment of exile from home and family, but it was when the slave auction block finally came to Jefferson's mountaintop after his death that it became clear just how deeply entangled Monticello was in the commercial world of American slavery. The constant threat of sale and separation was a cruel reminder to Monticello's African-American families of their legal status as property, and of the horrors of a slave system that profited from their bodies and their labor. In an effort to satisfy some of the enormous debt that Jefferson left to his white heirs when he died in 1826, over 100 men, women, and children were put on the auction block in 1827, and a further 33 people were sold in 1829. The buyers of these enslaved people, whose value constituted over 90% of the $31,400 appraised value of Jefferson's estate, included University of Virginia professors, local merchants, former Monticello overseers and artisans, and Randolph family members. Awaiting an uncertain fate, examined and bid on by slave traders and white neighbors, many Hearns, Hemmingses, Grangers, Hubbards, and Gillettes saw their family members for the last time. While several enslaved people continued to live with their new owners in Albemarle County, many more were taken to cotton country, to places like Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, and Alabama. For the enslaved families of Monticello, Jefferson's death was a tragic turning point in their lives that underscored their identities not as people, but as property. Israel Gillette Jefferson recalled that Jefferson's passing was an affair of great moment and uncertainty to us slaves. 11-year-old Peter Fawcett remembered that while he was born and reared as free, not knowing that I was a slave at Monticello, his owner's death suddenly placed him upon an auction block sold to strangers. Fawcett was one of many children to be separated from parents and siblings during the 1827 and 1829 sales. Though Fawcett resolved to get free or die in the attempt, it took him another 23 years and 2 failed runaway efforts to finally find freedom and rejoin his family in Ohio. However, many African-American families from Monticello were never reunited and remained scattered all over the country. Years after the Monticello slave auctions, Israel Gillette Jefferson never heard from his 4 children, Banbo, Taliola, Susan, and John, again. As they were born into slavery, they took the usual course of most others in the same condition in life, he wrote. I do not know where they now are living, but the last I heard of them, they were in Florida and Virginia. The legacy of a slave system that defined African Americans as chattel, as well as the permanent separation of so many family members, left its tragic imprint on Monticello's slave families for generations. As Hemming's descendant, Virginia Craft Rose, recalled nearly 200 years after several of her ancestors were sold at auction at Monticello. We couldn't forget slavery, but we could overcome it. Curiously, we accept Jefferson as the moral standard of the founders' era, not Washington. Perhaps it is because the father of his country left a somewhat troubling legacy. His emancipation of his slaves stands as not a tribute, but a rebuke to his era, and to the prevaricators and profiteers of the future. He declares that if you claim to have principles, you must live by them. After Jefferson died in 1826, the families of Jefferson's most devoted servants were split apart. Caroline Hughes, the 9-year-old daughter of Jefferson's gardener Wormley Hughes, went to the auction block. One family was divided among 8 buyers, and another was among 7. Joseph Fawcett, a Monticello blacksmith, was among the handful of enslaved people freed in Jefferson's will. But Jefferson left Fawcett's family enslaved. In the 6 months between Jefferson's death and the auction of his property, Fawcett tried to strike bargains with families in Charlottesville to purchase his wife and 6 of his 7 children. His oldest child had already been given to Jefferson's grandson. Fawcett found sympathetic buyers for his wife, his son Peter, and 2 other children, but he watched the auction of 3 young daughters to different buyers. One of them, 17-year-old Patsy, immediately escaped from her new master, a University of Virginia official. Joseph Fawcett spent 10 years at his anvil and forge, earning the money to buy back his wife and children. By the late 1830s, he had cash in hand to reclaim Peter, who was about 21, but the owner reneged on the deal. Compelled to leave Peter in slavery and having lost 3 daughters, Joseph and Edith Fawcett departed Charlottesville for Ohio around 1840. Years later, speaking as a free man in Ohio in 1898, Peter, who was 83, would recount that he had never forgotten the moment when he was put up on the auction block and sold like a horse. Imagine the trauma and, worse, the number of families that were displaced. Do you think this disturbing truth should be revisited and justice should be served, even though it's been centuries? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.